out of the way. I'm so glad to see so many of you here today. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Washington Women's Foundation learning event, Beyond the Numbers, Investing in Women, Girls, and Gender Identity. My name is Catherine, and I'm the Events and Programs Manager here at the Washington Women's Foundation. And before we get started on our formal program, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are gathered here on a stolen and unceded Indigenous homeland, and in the context of broken treaties and unresolved harms to Native peoples. We are on the traditional land of the First People of Seattle, the Duwamish, and of the Coast Salish, the Stillaguamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish, who have made and continue to make their homes here around the Salish Sea. We recognize as well that we live in a nation of wealth, a wealth created by the subjugation and exploitation of African peoples brought to this land through chattel slavery. We honor and uplift the original Indigenous stewards of this land and the forced contributions from generations of Africans. This is an acknowledgement of stolen land and stolen labor, and a recognition that the impact of these wrongs reverberates into our present day. Our acknowledgement does not replace authentic relationships, but serves only as a first small step in honoring, with gratitude, the land on which we live. Since some of you are new here today, we would like to take a moment to talk about the work of the Washington Women's Foundation. The Washington Women's Foundation is a strong and inclusive collective of informed women who together impact community transformation through grant making and applying a trust-based philanthropy lens. We value and encourage active learning, thoughtfulness, and uplifting the voices of those in our community who are experts and leaders in their fields, like today. We are delighted that you're here, so honored that you would choose to spend this next 90 minutes with us, and we're thrilled to learn and grow together in community. I'd like to introduce our amazing moderator for today's conversation, Radha Friedman. Radha is an award-winning donor advisor on a mission to invest in women leaders, especially women and girls of color and historically marginalized groups who receive only 1% of philanthropic gifts throughout the world. A bridge between funders and nonprofits, Radha uses her experience across 60 countries to connect funders with world-changing nonprofits. I'll hand it over to you, Radha.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you for everyone at the Washington Women's Foundation and everybody who's here joining us today. It's great to see you. So every single social movement that I've ever heard of that changed the world really started as a group of people who gathered together, usually around some delicious food. I see many of you eating it, and I'm going to try to ignore it. So they came together to think about what they could do personally to change their communities, to make them safer and more just. So I just want to thank you for being part of that virtual kitchen table with us here today. I'm super excited to be joined by Rosella Kennedy, Director of Equity and Impact at Camber Collective, and Angelica Rotunova, co-founder of the CEE-CNA Collaborative Fund. She's going to spell out that acronym for us so that I don't have to. I wanted to say that we really want this to be an interactive conversation. So we'll have plenty of time for Q&A with all of you at the end of your conversation. So if there's something that we say and you have a real burning question, be sure to note that and jot it down somewhere so you don't forget, like me when I walk downstairs and forget why I went down there in the first place. So let's start with some introductions so that you know a little bit more about us and you know who we are. Again, my name is Radha Friedman. This is the kind of name you get when your mother is Hindu and your father is Jewish. And I wanted to share a little bit of what brings me to this work and how I arrived here on this Zoom call in front of all of you today, and why this conversation feels so important right now in this moment in our world. And then I will also ask Angelica and Rosie to share the same, because we each really bring something unique to the conversation and different perspectives as well. So I am incredibly passionate about gender equality. a gender equality nerd even. This is all I have done for my entire life. I've spent the last 25 years really deeply engaged in this work inside nonprofits, inside grant-making foundations, and as a consultant to corporate philanthropy teams, because I really want to move as many resources as possible so that women and girls in the world have more choices and options and don't get trapped in situations where they have a lack of choices and options. I'm on a mission to encourage more investments in women, girls, and gender expansive folks and other historically marginalized groups who receive so little of philanthropic dollars. And I do this work today as an independent consultant, as a donor advisor, and also as a nonprofit coach for leaders to help really move this work forward. I've done this all over the world. I've moved money and resources through more than 100 grants across 61 different countries. And I've worked with some of the largest foundations in the world, with probably some familiar names that you'll recognize: the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative, most recently with Mackenzie Scott's Yield Giving. But I've also worked with some of the smallest, scrappiest little nonprofits that you've never heard of. For those of you who are here in Seattle, you may know me from some of my earlier work at Landesa, where I co-founded the Center for Women's Land Rights. And I've been really lucky to work with luminaries like the Dalai Lama, President of Malawi, Joyce Banda, actor Kristen Bell, who use their platforms to really help promote the message of gender equality and why it's so important. Most importantly, one time I carried Ruth Bader Ginsburg's bag, one time. I also host a podcast called Radical Good, where I talk about how each of us can make our own greatest difference in the world and what it's really going to take to move the needle on gender equality. And just a few weeks ago, I published a book called Fundraising Without Burnout, which really, the book begins by talking about how it is that the nonprofit sector became so gendered to begin with, and what that means, why the vast majority of people who work in nonprofits identify as women, and how, just like any profession that is majority women employees, they are undervalued, underpaid, asked to do a million things, wear a million hats, and are more prone to burnout. So I really want to help change the course of that so we all feel worthy. So now I'd like to ask my two co-panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start with you, Rosie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Rosie Kennedy, and I am joining you today in my role as Director of Impact and Equity for a global strategic advisory firm called Camber Collective. And what I do at Camber is I try to help support equitable practices within the humanitarian development, philanthropic, and social impact sectors. I jotted down on the back of a napkin in Paris last July of last year my reaction to being kind of told off by a man in French in a restaurant about le wokisme américain and our imperialistic viewpoint of what equity and justice needs to look like. And that gave me pause, because I was like, okay, this is going to be an anthropological lesson for me as well as a language lesson. So I let him keep talking. And when I realized, in listening to him, besides the fact that he just was kind of misogynistic and, didn't want social change and social good in the world, was that there really sometimes is a tendency that we have in the global north to consider that we have the right answer because we have access to the money or the power or the influence, etc., and not to take into account the localized nuance and collective viewpoints or needs. And when we think about that, we usually think of that in terms of the global north and the global south. But here was a friction between the US and France, which we are familiar with. We've had many over the years. So it really got me thinking about what are the ways we need to really show up with humility, openness, vulnerability, and be solicitous in asking those we are trying to engage in what they need, rather than assuming we know what they need. Because just like all people with changing experiences and contexts, what we might think that they need or what we might know that they need from the past may be different. 6 months later or today. So that's a big part of the work that I try to do at Camber. It coheres with the rest of me because I too am an author. I have a project that I do on the side called Brave Sis Project, and it really is about uplifting Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous women in history who have been erased. This book I published in April on Workman Press, and this is the journal planner I self-produce every year. So through 4 years of doing this hard work, I've really been able to dive in deeply to thinking about whose voice gets heard, whose story gets told, who gets erased, who gets uplifted as a hero, who gets to be an inspiration to others, and who doesn't. And that has led me to this deep, deep practice of decentering default whiteness narratives in basically everything that I do. And so that's how all of the pieces of my life kind of come together in the work that I try to promulgate. And actually tomorrow, I'm going to Washington, D.C. to be part of this Dodendra Feminology art exhibit and activation on the mall that's going to have luminaries like Dolores Huerta, a role model for sure, and Tarana Burke, a living role model and brave sis for our future. And I just got asked to do it and I said yes. And so I'm curated a list of intersectional feminist book lists for this event, and I will be out there. And the reason I bring all of that into the space is to say, I think a big piece of what we're called to do as thought leaders and change agents, particularly when it comes to women and girls and as women or femme identifying people, is to be looking out on the horizon and ask ourselves, what can we say yes to? What can we say yes to? How can we subvert norms around what's allowed, what's appropriate, what's good, what's helpful? And really just be very open in this moment. We're in a moment of severe retrenchment and battle lines and whataboutism. And I think the feminine drive that we have in us as generative people is something really important to tap into right now in this moment. That is my intro. And my outro, perhaps, because that was long. Thanks, Radha.
Thank you so much, Rosie, for sharing that. And just so you all know, Rosie did make sure that she could figure out how to be a part of this panel before she runs off to hang out with Gloria Steinem. So thank you again. Angelica, please introduce yourself and share what brings you to this work.
Thank you so much, Radha. Just such a joy. On my screen, I'm in between the two of you. I feel like I'm held in this, and I have not authored a book yet, but maybe now is in this, but I have produced quite a lot of knowledge over the last 25 plus years, mostly around the funding trends and analysis on funding available or not available for women's rights organizations, more of which we will talk about. But my journey really started as a young activist in Uzbekistan, where I'm from. I'm Armenian from Uzbekistan, and everything that both of you have said about that, that you have been advocating for, I am originally one of those girls that has been kind of plopped out on my community and chosen, so to speak, by funders to invest in because they saw potential in me, very randomly in some ways, because I grew up in around the collapse of the Soviet Union, when a lot of Indianization was happening and there was a lot of the Western presence in my country, without a lot of really integrating in the community and understanding the community. We at the time, as young people, were organizing and having debate clubs in high schools and universities. And I remember explicitly we had a very well-known foundation that has changed their name several times since then. And then I won't name them, but if you go back into the history of my region, you will know very well who that is. They basically came and approached us and saying, hey, we have some funding for your debate clubs, would you like to be funded? And in the nature of the debate club, we debated if we should get the money from them. And it was a very interesting conversation in the community, and we were between the ages of 17 and 22. And basically the debate was, what will that money do for us versus what will this money limit us in? And there was a split in the club. And then some of us decided not to be involved with anything that has the money attached to it. And some decided to go with the money. And basically what that split also meant is that, we were correct in that the money will influence the direction of the conversations, because with the money came some strings attached about what it is that we can and cannot debate, where we should and should not be showing up. And then some of the topics, the way they were framed and put on the table, got us on the radar with our government, which eventually got many of us expelled from the country, or put us on the security list with the government, where we were getting in trouble. I have been living now for 22 years in exile. One of the reasons is because of the work that I have been doing, and some of the work that I have been doing back home has been very much influence of this like liberal democratic agenda that was coming from the US and Europe towards us, without us really understanding and nuancing it for our own culture. What that experience taught me very much is that it was like this aha moment, is like, yes, I got all of this interesting, amazing knowledge, but it was not translatable for my community. So then you have about 90% of my generation basically got excavated from my country, and we are not there. Like some of us are coming back now, and actually a new president of the country has been issuing, a welcome back to a lot of us to come back. But it's been a very interesting experience that has positioned me in a way of like, okay, so how do the funders and what responsibilities do the funders have coming in from outside to inside? And then I serendipitously ended up being a funder. I worked for the Global Fund for Women, where I developed the whole portfolio for that part of the world for the region. And number one priority for me and for the fund at the time was that we are listening to the voices and we are not dictating what happens. And so it was a very elaborate conversations with the communities and with the movements. What do you need? How do you need it? And we were in a position at the time to give unrestricted funding. And I was funding basically anything from the guerrilla takeover of a military, stations to political organizing for advocacy in the Balkans post-war. And it was like the spectrum of different engagements and investments in the feminist organizing was so liberating as a funder, also to come in and saying, okay, we had this phrase at the Global Fund at the time, letting 1,000 flowers bloom. And it was like really beautiful of like this, you're not kind of like honing down. It's like, if only we passed the law on abortion, we got this, but it was like a very much an expansive understanding. But then I realized that there was not a lot of money that I'm working with. It was very, very limited. And that's where I kind of shifted to really researching and doing a lot of advocacy with other funders of how to move more money. So that I'm going to stop there with just maybe like a last piece about kind of practicalities of how I have done it beyond the funding and research is also I'm a co-founder of FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, and now a co-founder of this new fund, the Cessna Collaborative Fund, which stands for Central Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central North Asia. I was blissfully consulting for 5 years, really loving my polyamorous professional life when Putin decided to invade Ukraine, and then I pivoted fully for my region, and that's where my work has been focusing for the last 2 years. Thanks, Radha.
Thank you so much for each of you bringing a little bit more about your story, your background, the kind of work that you've been doing, and how it all paints a picture of how we're all working within a movement, trying to push at this from multiple angles. And the reason that we wanted to have multiple lenses on this conversation is because we know that each of us is giving to organizations locally, sometimes nationally, and sometimes globally. And there's a lot of cross movement of what is happening because people are moving across borders. There are refugees that are coming here, that are people going to other countries. Many of us also have family and friends who are living in other countries. And all of this work is connected, right? You can support, for example, funding reproductive equity, understanding that it may be more effective to fund work in another state, knowing that people here are covered already, but it might be people in other locations who can use the funding more, who really need the funding more. And so part of the way we're centering this conversation is, how do we get the funds to people who need it the most who have historically had the least access to it, and taking a gender lens on why things are the way they are and what we can do to change them. So let's just jump right into that. I mean, let's talk about the current funding landscape today, because I think that will ground us for the conversation and some questions that we all might have about this. So let's paint the picture of the current landscape of funding today that is specifically going towards women and girls and issues of gender equality. So I think most of us by this time, if you've made it to this call, have heard the very sad statistic that less than 2% of philanthropic funding in the US is invested specifically in nonprofits that focus on women and girls. It's around 2.5% for gender expansive folks and less than 1% for women of color. So I'd love to just talk a little bit about why you think that is. How did we get to this dire statistic of this paltry, minuscule amount of funding for this issue? Angelica, do you want to start on this one?
How much time do we have? Just kidding. So this is definitely something that I have been doing and thinking about so much. Some of you, if you know that I kind of one of the research reports that really positioned a lot of conversations on where's the money for women's rights has came out about 10 years ago. And we named it at the time, Watering the Leaves, Starving the Roots. And earlier this summer, I was asked to talk about like 10 years later, what are the trends 10 years later? So maybe I'll highlight a little bit of that kind of departing from that piece of work. And so unfortunately, not a lot of things change. And so one of the statistics that we have put forward in that research 10 years ago is that an average income or budget of the women's rights organizations around the world is $20,000. Collectively, 740 organizations that responded to our survey had $105 million in budget, which it was at the time 1/3 of the budget of Greenpeace. And so when we talk about impact, so oftentimes women's organizations are like, what is your impact? How much have you achieved? What have you done? When we're talking about this miserable amounts of money that is being invested, then the impact is, you also cannot really calculate it that much. However, still look at all of the pushback and the impact that we have achieved with this little money. If the investment was fantastic, it would have been threefold and more. And we wouldn't be right now, what we're experiencing is putting down the fires from the backlash that we're experiencing. Instead, we would have been so much more ahead. So the first one is we are still watering the leaves and we're starving the roots, for sure. The second one is that the trend that I am seeing, that organizing has changed, but the funding hasn't. A lot of the organizing is happening on the intersections of different issues and struggles and movements, but the funding is very, very siloed. So the fund that we have just started for Central Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia is focusing on crisis response, preparedness, prevention, and recovery. In that larger region, not only Ukraine, with the lens from different intersectional movements. The second I say is this a feminist fund, but not women's fund. I'm being put in a portfolio, a funding portfolio within a foundation that is women specific. While our work belongs in crisis, in peace and security, in HIV, in disability, in all of these different portfolios, and even one foundation really has hard time figuring out how within itself to become intersectional. I've had multiple conversations with foundation officers saying, could you go back internally, have a conversation among yourselves, different portfolios, and come back, because we don't belong in one. And there is really no structure within the foundations right now to do that. So organizing changed, funding really didn't. The third one I would say is there's a deepening of authoritarian regimes and militarization around the world that is impacting organizing and funding. Over 75 countries around the world currently have adopted the law that is quote unquote foreign agent law that got initiated by Russia a long time ago, and now it's going to be replicated around the world. What that means is, as foundations-based in the US, you are not able to reach those groups. However, many foundations are still requiring formal registration with the government in order to access and be eligible for their funding. So we're not really adjusting to the fact that the groups are really not able to do this work. And then the anti-rights movement is so strong and so well funded. And so again, like we are putting such a little money comparatively to the anti-right that is resourced like startups. If you look at how the anti-rights movements are resourced, the same way I'm sitting in Berkeley, California, there is a 25-year-old that comes up with an idea and say, trust me, I will do this. And people are putting millions of dollars without any requirements, without any accountability mechanisms, and saying, go, come back when you got it figured out. We don't have the same luxury. We have to report every 3 months to 6 months on any spendings that we have, and that is really dragging us and not allowing us. What I see with that is the next trend, and I will say, is that the shifting in the power of money. So the fact that we created our fund, and then there's a lot of funds like ours, is a response to that, is a response to the fact that the traditional philanthropy is not doing enough. And it's not responding to what we need. Instead, we want to really shift the power and control of the money to the communities that are the most impacted and that are the closest to the struggles, and they have solutions. So the creation of the Frida Young Feminist Fund, for example, it's been 13, 14 years ago. As you can tell, I'm not a young feminist any longer, but was basically in response that we didn't have spaces to have a power over our own money and our own decisions. And so that I see that trend more and more. There is a Black Feminist Fund that has gratefully been getting so much support and resources right now because they really want to be in control of their own money and their own decisions of how the money is being spent, instead of somebody sitting in New York or Washington and makes a decision. So that I see the shifts in who's controlling the resources. Still not enough. We still need more. And then the last I will say is that we're seeing the trend of the new money coming in philanthropy. So Radha mentioned Mackenzie Scott, which definitely shook up a lot, and I think put to shame a lot of traditional philanthropy around the slowness and the risk aversion that the traditional philanthropy has. However, it also comes with the big questions around accountability and transparency, because who has a reach and access to that money and who doesn't. And also there is an opportunity for a conversation around the unfair economic system that is perpetuating the access to this much wealth for certain individuals, and how do we make sure that we are actually working, and the philanthropy is part of working towards shifting it so we don't have to perpetually have the same problem. I'm going to pause there. I can go forever as I prefaced, but hopefully this is warming us up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This is like a running joke, I know, but that report from AWID, from the Association for Women's Rights and Development, Watering the Leaves and Starving the Roots, is like the seminal piece of research and data that really paints the picture of what's happening in the funding landscape, how little actually gets to some of these issues, even though people sometimes speak in platitudes about how they support the issues. When we really look to see if there's money going there, there isn't. And this is not specific to just funding women and girls either, right? We saw all of this happen a few years ago when the US erupted in racial injustice protests over George Floyd, and all of these corporations came forward and proposed money. 90% of that money hasn't appeared either. So this is a problem for philanthropy writ large. Rosie, this is a good segue for you to jump in. What do you think is part of what's driving this inequity in funding?
Yeah, it is a problem of the human condition writ large. And so I'm going to take us up several steps here to the top floor of the building, okay, which is the mindset piece, right? Because I spend a lot of time thinking about mindsets, thinking about elemental stories, existential stories, and trying to trouble notions of binary, right? Thinking either or and whataboutism, etc. So couple of, as you were talking, Angelica, I was just writing down some words here, and So there's structural reasons why we have these discrepancies. One of those being familiarity bias, likes, right? And the history of Western capitalism. And when I say capitalism, sometimes people bristle. I am actually not, as I say those words, advocating that we burn down the central banks and do something else. That's a conversation for a different day. That's not this conversation. I'm talking about the economic system that manages the way we move money and think about wealth and prosperity in our Northern and Western societies, okay? So when we think about the structures that built that over time, we know what they are. They were extraction, they were labor and capture, they were punishment and a scarcity mentality. They continue to exist as a carceral framework, which is, I'm going to make sure that there are as many opportunities for you to fail to receive this support as possible. We've seen all of that, and we've talked about how, we'll talk more about this in a minute, how more and more foundation professionals and others are starting to see the light, if you will, and understand some of the underbelly that prevails in those systems and want to trouble that and shift the way they do it, more trust-based philanthropy. I have a wonderful quote from a new friend that I'll share later along those lines. But this really does come down to the human condition and mindset, and what you believe in your heart and soul is the worth of another person, and is your obligation to the world as someone who may have been graced with unearned wealth, unearned access, unearned privilege, being in the room where it happens, to quote our dear old Hamilton. And what I find really interesting when you talk to people who are in a position to make a change, it really comes down to if they have on a very personal, we talked about going from the personal to the interpersonal to the organizational to the sectoral, right? As a framework. We're looking at that now at Camper. Have they asked themselves the simple question, what do I have to give up in order to ensure that someone else has?
No, they brought me.
And that's really where the rubber hits the road. The minute you've got to trouble your norms and rethink the way you've always done business, which we really are called to do in an imperative way now with all of the cataclysms happening around the world. There's a moment of personal reflection when you say, okay, it's going to look like this. I have to give this up, but I'm going to do it because it has to be done. And I will give an example of that. I was in a meeting with Foundation Women, and then I'll give an antidote that's happier. Foundation Women, and they were saying, oh, this work is so hard. We are exposed to so much sadness and misery. Every quarter, we give our whole team a week off, and we go on a retreat, and we have massages, and we do self-care and all this stuff. And I was just sitting there going, holy mother of God. And I raised my hand and I said, I hope you follow the airplane rule of, as soon as you've secured your oxygen mask, look around and see who else needs an oxygen mask. We get into this sort of hierarchy of performativism, whereas I am anointed without having earned it because I have money or power. Therefore, I'm special, and I'm going to always be special. I created a cartoon about this that I call Sally Savior, and we can talk about Sally Savior later. But the antidote to that, and that's just a really personal aha moment of, wait a minute, I am continuing these frameworks of carceral thinking, of labor, extraction, punishment. Those are not, if we're speaking in the binary of woman, man, or feminine, masculine, or whatever, those are not divine feminine frameworks. Those are toxic masculine frameworks, right? To go back to Barbie movie, if you want, right? Those are a bunch of Ken sitting around with their Mojo Dojo Casa House mentality, right? If we can remember what was at the root of what is the divine feminine and hold that and really continue to kindle that as a driving force, I believe it can be little by little an antidote. And I'll give you an example. I was at the Opportunity Collaboration gathering earlier this month. We were in a group of people talking, and it ended up that one of the women in our group, who is celebrated for all of the achievements she creates in the social impact space, was dying inside as a human being, dealing with unaddressed trauma that I would never have been able to survive. Never, not even a day of what she survived. I'd be gone. And on the other hand, and loneliness and no one asking who she was as a person and what she needed. On the other hand, being celebrated in a performative way, in a superficial way by funders like, look at this one we've plucked up and raised this way. She just happened in a passing moment to say, to confide. She is a Black woman like me. And so she felt she could confide in me what was truly going on. I said, you got to come to the Afro Women group. There's a group of diasporic women getting together. She came, she gave her testimony, literally. I don't use religious words very often, but this was that. And 30 women sat in room, including, our dear friend Rada, our dear mutual friend who was with me. We won't say her name, who's the person who introduced us. We were all on our knees crying at the stark tragedy and triumph of this human and her pain. In that moment, we all decided we're going to do whatever it takes to make it better. One woman just went to a foundation and said, let me find $3,000 to get her mental health care in her home country, so she would not be subjected to the kind of psychiatric care I've had at times, not psychiatric, but mental health care I've had at times, which hasn't been culturally appropriate at all. We're going to get her a solar water thing for her house, so her actual physical situation of needing to care for her family can be $2,000 it was to do that. And now her daughter's just gotten into medical school, nursing school, and they need $3,000 by next week to pay the tuition. And we are driving to do that. We're telling our friends. And why I share this is because that is mutual aid. And last week, with the horror and terror and rupture we're experiencing everywhere we look, it felt so good to cut the crap and just get to what do you need in this moment. And the overall amount is $8,000. Are you kidding me? Let's do this. And I think that was the divine feminine in action. We are all so fired up to be in this holy space together. If we can take that idea and that ideal and do it at scale and try to trouble our systems and our organizations that push against it and say, no, we know this is the way we have to create change, then I think there's more hope. And that's what I'm holding my hat on. That's what I'm hanging my hat on this week. So that's just the perspective I want to share. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that, Rosie. We did frame this by saying we were going to zoom in and out from the local to the global. And I feel like you just did a perfect job of that, Angelica, by laying out what are the global trends around why so little funding is getting to issues of equality. And then this concept of how we are watering the leaves, but not really getting the kind of funding to the roots that is needed. It's the same phenomenon we see in grant making when we give money only to a project or a program, but we don't really invest in like the overhead of the organization or in the work of the individual leaders. They need investments. They need capacity building too. So Rosie, your story, your example that you just shared from that conference is like a microcosm of what it looks like when you water the leaves but starve the roots. You celebrate people and say, what great work you're doing in the community, but you don't actually give them the support that they need. And I love the idea of trying to figure out how we can recalibrate that, each of us, through our own personal giving, through our family foundations, through collective foundations, through giving circles, whatever that takes, to really be, connected in that way. Because the word philanthropy is, love for humanity. And I forget that sometimes, but it really is, our philanthropy is what our love looks like out in the world,
And Rada, I want to say another point on top of that. Like, we always say in philanthropy, it feels better to give than to receive. And we've gotten a little caught up in other structures that remove us from that. That good feeling of knowing that we can collectively help a sister out, who is, by the way, helping thousands of women in her home country. So it is a payout. It is a, that's what makes us human, actually, I think, and not machines. And so particularly for women's foundations and women philanthropists, I think it's so important, almost as a brand action, to allow ourselves access to the good feeling that you get and the generative good of being able to shift something right away. And then we saw that during COVID with all the emergency funding.
Mhm.
Saw it with the guaranteed income that happened for folks. We
Mhm.
know that these things are possible. It is a lie and a play acting story we're told that tells us we can't. And I think we're at an existential moment in society where we have to say no. We reject that paradigm.
Mhm.
We are boldly, we are brave. We are being brave sisses. We are
Mhm.
boldly planning a different way.
I love that message of courage and bravery, because it does require breaking from tradition and best practices. So let's look at the flip side of this. So if the money is not going towards gender equality for whatever reason, for the many reasons that you've laid out here, where is the funding going? What are the things that are getting the most interest and support? Angelica, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, I do. I think depends on what slice of money we're talking about, right? So as I mentioned, and I really cannot emphasize it enough, that it's very, very important to look at the money that is going against the rights and justice and equality that I'm assuming all of the people on this call and a lot of the foundations that we are talking about are standing for rights and justice and equality. So that, chunk of money comparatively to what is going against is very, very small. So it's already like just comparative amounts. We're talking billions of unrestricted long-term support that is going to all of the anti-rights, anti-gender, and anti-democracy organizing around the world. Anything from individuals to priests, to radio stations, to TV shows, to journalistic programs, you name it. Very, very strategic, very, very elaborate. We have people who moved into the government positions from these nonprofits that were anti-gender, anti-rights nonprofits all around the world. The president of Hungary was a former president of the largest anti-rights organizations around the world. So we have to really look at like the strategy, and it's 30 years, last 30 years strategy that has been deliberately funding those organizations and movements and preparing them for takeover. So I think that is a very important piece to know of where money is going. Not your money, not our money, right? But the way the money of the world is going to right now. Another chunk that is going somewhere is military. And comparison here that I give is if we say we want to be fit and we spend 70% of our time on the couch, probably result is not going to be fit. We keep saying we want peace and justice. Sorry, Rosie. Not going to be the result of fitness. It will be a result of something else. Some other pleasures will happen, but not fitness. If we say we want peace and security and justice, but we spend enormous percentages of our annual budgets in every single government of the world towards military industrial complex, we will not have peace. We will have war, and we will have the self-perpetuating industry that wants more wars in order to keep making income. That is where the money is going. And I'm zooming out again, right, first to really explain that in terms of the distribution of resources around the world, we do not have a problem of resources, we have distribution problem. We have choices, moral choices that the governments and individuals are making on a daily basis on where we are putting our money and where we're putting our energy. Now you have that zoomed out picture of military spendings, anti-rights spendings, and then let's zoom into the social justice, fantastic, beautiful organizations and foundations that we are all part of. It is drop in the bucket comparatively to those budgets, yeah? And even within that, then you get even more kind of like pulling up and down and what is more important. And one of the reasons for that is that one is oftentimes foundations are looking to silver bullet solutions, and pun intended with the military language. It is all about how do I then count that I can attribute this success or this impact to me and my money. So I think that one of the problems that we often have in philanthropy is this desire of attribution. And the old school philanthropy was very easy to attribute because you have your name on a building or in a gallery and you're like, check, my family did this. It's much, much harder when we're talking about gender equality or racial equality to say, if we invest $5 million, what happens with that money and how can we attribute the success to us? It's impossible. And therefore, oftentimes what I see, and I have done a lot of strategy work with a lot of foundations, where they go narrow and narrow and narrow. Let's decide at least we invest in this country or in this project and this particular intervention. And this is where we can measure, because we want to measure results. We want to measure our contribution. What happens with that is that you self-satisfy to be able to measure, but the bigger picture is actually broken because we don't have the ecosystem approach to the funding. We are not looking at like, what are the bigger pieces and everything that needs to be supported. Therefore, everything that is harder to quote unquote sell gets less money. For example, racial justice, gender equity and equality. Right now, my latest research is on resourcing adolescent girls. It is super difficult to track where's the money going to adolescent girls because they're lost in children's funding and they're lost in women and girls funding. And in either way, there's different approaches to how do you approach the girl. Does she have agency? Does she have power? Does she have decision-making? Which is what women and girls' rights institutions are looking at. And at the children's funding, she doesn't have agency. She needs to be protected. And so there's also clash in even frameworks from which we are approaching funding. So one is, let's start thinking about not attributing to ourselves some of the success and thinking that we are contributing towards. Two is really positioning ourselves, any kind of funding institutions within the larger ecosystem. Okay, what is this larger contribution we're trying to make and what it is that we're working quote unquote against? And three is like, are we clashing with each other? There's no one solution, but there are some terrible decisions and solutions. So really looking at like how much harm you can also make with some of your decisions is a very good invitation for the funders.
I love that. I just wrote down like 10 different quotes of things that you said that I thought were all really, really powerful. And it made me think of something that I heard from the director of the Haas Foundation, the Walter and Elise Haas Jr. I don't know their full name, the Haas Foundation. And she said, I think we have to remember when we're working in this field that we're making decisions every day. We're trying to do the most good we can, right? But all of the decisions that we're making every day are among a series of pretty good options. And for the people who are receiving the funds and who need the funds, they don't have good options all of the time. And I think that's really something to keep in mind with that power differential. Rosie, anything you want to add to this about what is getting funding, what is getting support and interest?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at some of the statistics, right? Health and education, like hospitals and stuff, and universities, your alma mater, right? Things of that nature. And, I am a survivor of fundraising. I was a fundraiser for a decade, and a lot of it in the arts and cultural space, which suffers so much, right? Just forgotten because we've stopped seeing that as part of the civic fabric of what makes societies work, at least in this country we have. But the through line that I see in all of that, as well as the sort of reactive response, which is a good response to humanitarian issues, such as, Acapulco right now with the hurricane, the stealth Hurricane Otis, what's going on right now, obviously in the Middle East, and responding to that in all sorts of different ways. And even sort of like once Roe v. Wade was destroyed, the quick response to women's rights issues in reproductive justice and health. In 2020, everyone put a black square and gave as much money to Black run groups as they can, as well as COVID. A lot of it is reactive and it's knee jerk and it's performative, and it's about the ego, right? Especially in the arts, like your name on the building or the hospital wing or whatever. And again, for me, it comes down to that idea of how in touch are you with your actual values, your altruism, or how much is this a reflection of your own vanity, quite frankly. That's why I don't do fundraising anymore, because I would ask questions like that and people would they'd be like a little put off, but it really is that. And so for me at least, and I believe like the kind of, if we want equitable funding and we want funding that responds to needs and there's more focused on mutual aid and hearing what people need as opposed to us deciding, we really have to take our egos and selves out of the equation and think of something again at the top floor that's holy, that's way, 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 way up here. I don't know if philanthropy, well, I know philanthropy was not created with that mindset. It was created as a way for the robber barons to feel less bad and to have some tax relief, but I think if we look outside of that paradigm and think about the humanity of those who can help others who don't, and really stay connected to our values, we might begin to see a shift. And that, I guess, that's where I think people like the work you do is so important, Radha, advising people and having the humility to say, you know what, I'm not quite sure where I can best help. Tell me. And also where women's funding circles are so powerful. Let's get together and spend the time together to learn about the issue so we are informed and not reactive. Right. I think that's really important. But Angelica, I mean, the piece about the military industrial complex and the boys with their toys, I mean, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even have words. Yeah.
I think that's really important. And I think it's really powerful for us to know. And one of the things that I am always keeping in the back of my head is beyond the big institutions of philanthropy that we often think of, like when we hear the name or the word philanthropy, people tend to think about like really well-known people who are on the cover of Fortune magazine, or they tend to think about like well-known, almost name brand foundations. They think of Rockefellers and Fords and that kind of thing. And they forget how much money is actually being moved in all of these different ways through collective giving, through giving circles, through community foundations, through all of the different ways, right? In terms of thinking about what each of us can do to change this, one thing that I often hear, because I work with a lot of women donors who sit at the intersection of patriarchy, and the other thing, and all the other areas and the other forms of oppression, they often think, well, I'm just one person, I can't really do anything. Or I'm only one person in a foundation, it's really my boss that makes the decision. And the greatest way that we give up our power is by thinking we don't have power. There's over $200 billion sitting in donor advised funds right now. Like, how powerful would it be if we all organized and thought about what we could do to change things and to really shift them in different ways? I mean, I know this is starting to sound like we secretly recruited you to the Zoom call because, this is the revolution and we ride at midnight. But really, this is meant to be a practical conversation too, to think about what's happening in the bigger picture and what are things that each of us can do to contribute to the kind of world we want to live in, or the kind of world that we want to live to, the future ancestors. So what do you think about opportunities that are existing today to change the way that we invest in gender equality? I mean, where can we be bolder? Where can we go beyond writing checks? Is there anybody who's doing it well that you think is really inspirational?
Rosie, you want to go first? No. Thanks for this question, Radha, because I'm realizing we just kind of like doom and gloom so far. there is a lot of positive things that are happening, and it's a lot for me to say, who is very, very disenchanted with the world right this moment, when a lot of traumatic, very, very brutal, hurtful things are happening around the world. But I do wake up every morning thinking that there is a lot of good in the world, and there's a lot of positive energy in the world, and there's incredible, incredible people who are doing it, and they are everywhere, and they're from the grassroots organizers to people who are lobbying the governments, who are trying to shift the governments within, and who are trying to work on the feminist foreign policies within countries and governments that are traditionally, capitalistic and colonial, and that's a really big uplift for them. And there's also women and non-gender binary people within very wealthy families who are trying to do that too. So I do have the same experience as you, is where, I have advised several families where there would be, 1 or 2 women finally reaching the decision-making spaces within their own families, which is also, we have to admit that there's a lot of the patriarchy and the traditional structures happening with wealth. And then they're trying to find their way, and it takes time. And so I think that one advice I have is like really not to get discouraged, because change takes time. And especially, if anybody has ever done the awareness education, it's really hard to do it with adults. It's changing adult mindsets is very, very difficult. It's much, much easier to start earlier. So that's why maybe my research started going into like younger generation, more and more younger, because then that it's very easier to transition the change. But the advice that I would give, and then some of the positive examples that I would give, is that definitely kind of look what is your own theory of change within wherever you are at, to be able to really kind of impact and influence the spaces where you're at, and then take like one step at a time, and surround yourself with right people. Because oftentimes what happens, and especially in the private philanthropy, what I have seen is that some family members don't listen to their own family members. But when you bring somebody very fabulous and authoritative like Radha, and put her in front of the family, and then she'll bring somebody like us onto a panel to talk to the family, that makes a difference. And I have seen that change. And then taking them on a journey, taking the people really on a journey, meeting where they are at. I think that I have also learned a lot, and Rosie, you have touched on this, is that, it's about human nature too, right? To me, it's the importance of really understanding where people are coming from, and what is their worldview that has been shaped, and how to shift that, instead of just like going with the protest signs. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. And I have seen a lot of shift happen when you actually accept people's humanity and understand where they're coming from, and then work on that shift and longer term shift. And then the last thing I would say is that what I see, the positive things are happening, and back to my earlier point, is the shift of like who is in control of money. If you have any access to resources, really think about like who is making decisions on the distribution of those resources, and then work on like giving up and giving that power away to the communities that you believe in, because they know better. They really do. I come from the part of the world that has been off the radar of the funders. For 20 years, I've been talking about fund us. And most of the times I would hear the responses like, well, we didn't fuck you up, sorry for my language, but like, you're not our colonial problem, so therefore we don't really need to be investing in you. And then Ukraine gets invaded, and there's a ton of money gets poured in. So it's also like who then makes those decisions, and how how that distribution is happening. So thinking about really resourcing the organizations that are on the ground, and they're doing really fantastic job all across the world. And also admitting that sometimes things will not go well, and sometimes we will have to take risk. And then just like with the startups, not every one of them makes it. And so kind of really diffusing that a little bit of like, well, yes, if you have a $10 million portfolio, just forget about one of the millions, because something will go wrong, and that's okay. That's okay. And just accepting that that is okay is going to help and release a little bit from this kind of like holding on so much to the impact.
I really, really appreciate that point. I think we all need to take a look at how we define risk in philanthropy differently. Like, what are we really risking by giving a check to someone who needs it? And staying focused on what we've always done and the way that we've always done things is going to produce the same results. So we do need to think differently and try new things and invest in different things, or else we're always going to see exactly the same thing. Rosie, before I turn to you, I just want to note we're going to open it up to Q&A from all of you. So Rosie, any other thoughts that you want to add, and then we'll jump into the questions.
I loved the point you made, and I think Angelica, you made this point about like the generational shift, and like the you know, and some of the tensions that brings about. And you know, the Katali Foundation and the Libra Foundation are mother-daughter, and the daughter is one of my beloved friends, Regan, right? And we've known each other well before we even ever talked about philanthropy. I didn't even know who she was. We used to dance together in dance class in SF for 7 years. So our conversations were, I hope you're not on the call, darling, because it's embarrassing. Our conversations were in the shower after dance class. We talked about like life and its real things, right? And there was such a clear connection, 5 of us in that locker room, about where our values stood, right? And then as I got to know her, and I got to know her mother, of course, I'm not surprised that, you know, in my LinkedIn, Crystal Haling's posts are the ones that I see first, and she's doing all this amazing work, because that's who they are and that's what they're made from. And so I think the thing, like, you know, I shook my head and said, no, I really don't have anything to say. But the thing that I do have to say is it really becomes about, who do you surround yourself with? Who do you look to for inspiration? Who is saying the kinds of things that lift you up, and also demonstrating it and showing it, right? And I think this is something that the, you know, Washington Women's Foundation is really focused on as well, is like, how do we like even this conversation today, how do we bring like-minded people together to see each other and know each other and feel connected, feel less isolated and less alone. So and the other piece I'll say is, anyone can be a philanthropist. This is something I used to say when I was a fundraiser, whether $5 or $500,000. And I think that that piece is really important to bear in mind as well. You know, in the Black church, which I'm only familiar with in a theoretical kind of way, but you know, people tithe and they give money, and it's like, that's what you do. And they do that in the Muslim community as well. And we see it in all sorts of faith and other civic communities, where people give a little bit, no matter what it is, because that's what they're made of. And so I think having those conversations is a great door opening to start to, you know, build momentum and feel more encouraged.
Thank you so much for that. And Catherine, I don't know, are there questions in the chat, or do you want people to raise their hands, or both? Any way that you put a question forth will be honored.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, put it into the chat. Yeah, we'd love to hear.
Very friendly. We're very friendly with questions. We're not scary at all. But while I'm waiting for anyone to come forward, this is the good thing about moderators' prerogative. I'd love to just hear a little bit about like what your wildest dreams for reimagining what, you know, really resourcing and investing in women and girls and gender equality could look like for us individually, for everyone who's working inside a nonprofit that's trying to change their community, for our movements. What do you think it would look like if we really funded them the way they deserve to be resourced?
Barbie land. Yeah, no, for real. Like, you would float down from your bed and your breakfast would always taste delicious and everyone would say hello to you every morning and you would feel your cup is full and that you are loved everywhere you go. Like really, so how does that titrate to real life? Less want, less competitiveness, less scarcity, less hatred. The thing I wanted to say earlier as well, when we think about, I was listening to, Rachel Maddow's podcast this summer, and they were talking about how they've been taking migrants and sending up to northern states as a way of punishing those states for being blue, right? And in the 60s, when I was a little girl, even maybe before I was born, they did that with folks and they sent them to Hyannisport in Massachusetts, and they plucked Black women and their families from the South and put them on buses to Massachusetts and told them when they got off the bus, President Kennedy would be waiting for them, right? And so this was a big news item and it's been completely forgotten. And Rachel Maddow was talking about this, and like these women would get on the bus in their Sunday finest with a paper bag with all the possessions that they took with them in the paper bag, and they would do this 30-hour trip, being told either go because it's the land of milk and honey, or if you don't go, we're going to put your son in jail because he did a minor infraction. And this is in the South in the 60s where his life could have been lost, right? And then they got there and there was nothing. There was literally nothing, no food, no one to greet them, nowhere to stay, nothing. And the good people of Hyannisport were like, we cannot abide this. And they swooped in and they made it happen. And that's a very little known, that's a story that's been erased from history. As she was talking about it, she said there are 3 types of racists. There's the type that is, she was talking to a historian who said, there's the type who just doesn't pay attention because they don't have to. We know those folks. There's a type that's like, yeah, no, I don't like Black, brown, whomever, gay, disabled, old, whatever, ism people. And then they're the ones who are sadists, who are like, I actually take pleasure in other people's demise. And it was thinking about that third category that just really gutted me, because it's the opposite of everything we all stand for and look for in the world. We may not always be able to check our privilege enough to really touch down with what people need, but we're not out there to do harm. And this summer we saw a lot of that with the Blum, and his ongoing litigation to just really make sure that Black people and women are back in the field with nothing at all. That's his ultimate vision. And what we want is the opposite of that vision, right? So what the perfect world looks like, take whatever Andrew Blum thinks is right and take the opposite of that. And that's what we want, I think.
I love that. And there's a question that just came in about where you might have seen effective narrative change work to increase giving, particularly to Black, Indigenous, people of color, women and girls. And I think that's really interesting because of the narrative change component of it, not just where have you seen resources moving, but where have you seen narrative change work shifting?
Sherry, I want to ask you if you'd come off mute and share a little bit about what you've done in this, if you don't mind, because that's how we came to know each other. You were doing some really important narrative change work around Black women. Do you want to share a bit?
Sure. Thanks, Rosie, and thank you everybody for being here. I also have a background in fundraising, and I had spent 4 years working at Covenant House, which is one of the largest organizations in the U.S. to serve homeless and sex trafficked youth. And I worked at the shelter in Oakland. And after 4 years of working there and basically seeing a lot of young people that I loved and built strong relationships with and cared for being, fed to the wolves in terms of just all of these systemic failures that, a lot of them were systems involved and had terrible experiences in foster care, in the juvenile justice system, in schools. And so I decided to just pick up a camera and try to elevate their voices. And what I ended up doing was a very deep dive into a film about child sex trafficking in California and why it disproportionately impacts Black girls and women in femmes. And I ended up like just, having the opportunity to partner with a lot of really amazing people, including Kimberly Crenshaw, who did sort of the historical narrative for the film. And I got to go down to LA and be part of the African American Policy Forum and film Patrisse Cullors and meet some of the mothers from the Say Her Name campaign. And, and it was a labor of love. And I, had to do also a lot of like self-interrogation, like, who am I? Why am I making this film? Like, I'm an, Iranian Jew who grew up in LA. Like, why am I doing this? And at the end of the day, I had to come to the conclusion that like, I just didn't see anything else being made that I felt like had like a loving and humanizing gaze. And that was, in terms of like really doing a good job of ethically representing people in a multidimensional and humanizing way. And so, I used all of the savings that I amassed from working at a, homeless shelter and, cobble together grants. And luckily I had a fundraising background, so I was able to cobble together some grants and do Kickstarters and whatever it took. But I ended up making a beautiful film. And I think, like, just in terms of like reflecting your values and like, what can you do? I mean, I knew I didn't have money. I wasn't going to be a philanthropist in this space, but what I did have was a lot of fire in my belly from having done the work and having seen these kids come in and out, cycle in and out of the shelter with PTSD and depression and going back into the carceral system. And I just had a lot of conviction and energy, in part based on my own experiences being a kid and having a lot of the same risk factors, and making a promise to myself when I was a kid and saying, if I ever get to grow up, which I wasn't sure that I would, but if I ever get to grow up and like, if there's other kids who are experiencing similar things, like, I'm going to do something about it when I get to be old enough to have a little bit of power. And so in some ways that was also me fulfilling my promise to my younger self. And I guess all of that just to say, like, you don't know what you have to offer. We don't always appreciate what we have to offer. I had no background in film, but if you have a lot of fire in your belly, like, it's kind of astounding what you can do.
Sherry, I mean, so impressive. And I hate the part, because I remember working with you to try to get that money together for this film. I hate the part that, again, these small micro amounts would make such a difference. And then on the other hand, I'm not begrudging the folks who go off for the week in the spa and the retreat and the like learning your inner. I'm not, but it's like, if we think about the money and the distribution of it and where it's not landing, if that were made more clear and more evident, which we're starting to do. And Angelica, I mean, your research is so tremendous in this as well, not just in the US, not just in Oakland, right? But Oakland is a microcosm of the world as we go out. I think people can start to understand how to do some wayfinding, right, around. And I think that's really it's not people's fault that they don't know where to put the little bit of money they might have, because everybody's carrying so much in their daily life and so much. And how can we all know, again, which is where practitioners like you, Radha, are so essential. And I'm not saying that suddenly you're going to become like an app that everyone ties and say, where does the money need to go today? But I mean, really, that is what we could do, is using data for good, and actually, as opposed to aggrandizing the wrong things, let's really put it towards some positive change and possibility.
If I could build up on that, first of all, Sherry, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's like really beautiful to hear from you directly. And I think this is a wonderful example where the drive in your belly, and the activism comes from the activists, and then the money somewhat follows. Because like example I was going to give before you started talking is about the Pop Culture Collective. Is this collective of these different foundations that has come together deciding that the narrative change is very, very important to invest in. And now they are funding a lot of this writers' rooms for different projects, including big Netflix productions and whatnot, that are really nothing about us without us, borrowing from the disability rights movements. But they followed the movement. It's not like they came up with it. And I think this is also an invitation to the funders that you're not the ones to do the revolutionary thinking. Somebody else is doing it. The activists like Sherry are doing it. The activists that I'm working with in my regions are doing this. It is like how do you have your hand on the pulse of the movements? Like Black Lives Matter, for example, was not funded until it exploded. They could not get any money at all until it became big, and then everybody's fighting for them. So really kind of having your ear on the ground and really listening deeply, and then following that. And then the biggest also narrative change work that I have seen does come from really positioning about like, who is the narrator, right? Who is narrating the story? And one of the lessons learned that we have had in the gender justice movement, and I'm still like, I would love thought partners to sit down and actually talk about this, is like, how do we simplify our messages without dumbing them down too much? Or without like really stripping it of complexity. What we're working on is complex, and it's really, really difficult. And it's difficult to explain to somebody something that is so outside of their vicinity of like, how do you reach that? But somehow the anti-rights movements have figured it out so well. They have this very snappy, simple messages that are floating around so much around the world without being tested necessarily, but like believed as truth and as dogma. So can we like take a page from their book and like learn something and then translate it to us? And I know there is like a narrative change expert that are sitting down right now and trying to analyze it and whatnot. So I'm like really inviting those conversations more, because I think we can do much, much better job in the narrative change, and like really not losing the complexity, but not starting from like, well, it's hard to explain.
Right. You know who
Yeah.
does a lot around that too, whom I've been quoting a lot. And I'll say one more thing before that. You know, I mean, this is something I say to my colleagues at Camber Collective. We are a global strategic advisory firm. We're not a movement organization, but we want to be inspired by them and work in allegiance to the better world they want to see. And so a big part of it too is knowing your lane and knowing which part of the relay race you're supposed to carry with the baton, and really having clarity about that. But Loretta Ross, Dr. Loretta Ross, just does such a great job in this, and she did this in Anand Giridharadas' new book. I forget what it's called, but not Winner Take All, the other one, when she talks about the tent and the importance of having people in the tent who agree with you at least 40% of what you agree with, right? If it's less than 40%, forget it. And those of us who are progressives or on the left or whatever have you, ideologically, we often demand a purity test. And it's like, if you don't agree with this one thing, get out of my house, right? And the example that comes to mind for me, and this is pertinent to women and girls, is, in the Black church, for example, if we're looking at something to do with providing education or help or medical care, whatever, to women and girls, like Black girls, right? You got to be able to take money from people who don't agree with you about LGBTQIA+ issues, right? In that moment, just for that purpose, right? You got to be able to sit down with someone who is more conservative than you in that thing, because the thing that unites you is the thing you're working on now. And it doesn't mean you've sullied yourself or your image or your life by coalescing with them for this one micro thing. And we see that a lot in the Black church. People got together to protest the lives of young men being gunned down by the police who would not agree on some of those other things, right? put those other we don't lose track of them, but in this moment, what is the one thing we can agree on that has to happen? And the right does that so well. They
Mhm,
don't care what you believe, they just want to win.
mhm.
And it's hard. It wrenches me even as I say that. But I also think this moment that we are living in duality again around what is going, and plurality around what is going on in the Middle East, is a lesson to us to try to learn to stretch beyond the constraints of what we always demanded, to figure out what is the greater outcome we can try to strive for together, grasping across whatever divide to hold each other. And I mean, we are the force for good, so we have to, I believe, have to try to be able to find a way to do that.
That's the perfect way to sum that up. I just wanted to add, Sherry, to your question, that one group or one example that I've seen do this really well is a group called the Pop Culture Collaborative, which has been studying how getting an issue into the popular culture has vastly accelerated progress on some of the issues and the movements that we've been struggling with. So for example, they did some early research on marriage equality. And if you look at the timeline of history for almost any social progress movement, it's like this, right? You've got ups and then you've got downs, and you've got wins in the courts, and then you've got some sort of backlash. So they were looking at this line and going, how come, you had Stonewall, and then you had this, and then you had some other laws. What accounted for that line suddenly going up like this? And when they looked at what else was going on in the environment at that time, they realized the Ellen Show was on the air, Will and Grace was on the air, and it had become such a big part of popular culture that the mystery and the anti-LGBTQ, push behind it had dissipated. And that's what accounted for the win. So they now bring together funders along with folks in the entertainment industry who can like greenlight a movie at Netflix, and activists who are working at all of the leading nonprofit organizations to think together about what are the most important issues that they want to advance and how they might be able to get messages onto television and movies to help push the public forward to get that moving. And I realized, looking at the time, that we're quickly coming to the end of our time together today, and really want to be respectful and honor everyone's time and make sure you get out on time. So just like in really quick summary, I wrote down some brilliant things that each of you said, Angelica and Rosie. There was the reminder to really ask people what they need rather than assuming we know, even if we just asked them 6 months ago, because their needs may have shifted. There's the question also of reminding ourselves to say, what is it that we can each say yes to? We can't do everything, but every one of us can do something. There's a reminder that while organizing around social progress movements and gender equality has changed and become a lot more intersectional, funding hasn't necessarily caught up. It's still pretty siloed, and that is part of the reason why we aren't seeing more money supporting this kinds of thing. And Angelica, you had that beautiful quote, we don't actually have a problem with resources, we have a problem with distribution. It's like that Gandhi quote, there's more than enough in the world for everyone's needs, but not everyone's greed. And there was also a reminder, Rosie, to surround yourself with the right people, like everyone at the Washington Women's Foundation, for example. And how can we all imagine a world that has less competition and more collaboration and more abundance thinking rather than scarcity thinking? So I will leave it there. And really,
Rada, we had one thing in the chat, which was from Jackie. She wanted to know, what can we tell grassroots organizations to do differently? And I would say to that, keep telling your story with your own words. Like social media, use like a cam, whatever you have, like your phone, keep telling your story and not the story that someone else writes for you. I just wanted to speak that. Yeah.
Love that. Thank you so much. And Catherine, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Thank you all. It's so amazing to learn from you and be in community today. I hope everyone can join me in sharing your gratitude or sharing something that you have learned today or something that has impacted you from this conversation. And yes, we will be sharing out the recording to all who registered. And if you didn't register, feel free to share your email in the chat so we can get the material to you. Aviva, my wonderful colleague, has shared our event coming up where we will be funding women and girls in Washington State. We'd love for all to join that event happening on December 7th. And just a last gratitude to our speakers and to all of you for joining us today. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.